Hey, welcome everybody to the Anxiety at Work podcast. I'm Chester Elton, and this is my dear friend and cohort and, partner in crime, really, Adrian Gostick.
Hey everybody, we're delighted to have you with us today. We hope the time you're going to spend with us will help remove the stigma of anxiety and mental health in the workplace and your personal life. And we invite experts from the world of work and life to give us ideas and, most importantly, tools to deal with anxiety in our world.
And we're delighted to have our sponsor, Life Guides, who makes all this possible. Life Guides offers a community of trained and certified guides to provide guidance in over 400 topics of personal growth, lifelong learning, and life challenges. They're a strategic people offering by leading employers across all industries. So by providing employees with experienced and empathetic support across a broad range of everyday life events, employees lead happier and more productive lives, both at home and at work. Life Guide's mission is to grow a community by sharing life experience, wisdom, and empathy with a goal, and get this, with a goal of positively impacting the lives of 1 billion people within 15 years. I think that's about the viewership and listenership to our podcast about now. Right? Exactly. It's about 1 billion. Yep. Life Guides is modernizing human support and human connection, which is foundational to well-being. So get this, for listening to our podcast, you get 2 months free access, free for your team today. All you got to do is put in code 2422. Well, we want to welcome to our humble podcast our new friend and guest, Steve Bisson. And we love that because he grew up in Montreal. Adrian and I are both Canadians. We love talking hockey with Steve before we came on. Let's give you a little bit about Steve. He is a therapist, coach, author, and podcaster, a fellow Canadian who, like us, now lives in the States. Steve has worked in the mental health addiction field since 1999. He owns his own private practice called Straight to the Point Therapy. He is the author of the book Finding Your Way Through Therapy and host of the podcast of the same name. Steve, we're delighted to have a fellow Canadian on the podcast, eh? Welcome.
Welcome, and bonjour.
Bonjour, mon ami.
Well, hey, Steve, it is great to have you on the podcast. We want to get to know you first. And, what we know about you, your practice helps people of all backgrounds, but you especially help first responders, military personnel, those in law enforcement. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about what drew you to be a therapist and why your specialization.
Well, the first thing to say is that I wanted to be a therapist probably since age 16. And what happened is when I was 12 years old, my best friend died in a fire.
Oh, gosh.
And during those, this is the 1980s. So at that time, he played football with me. We played soccer together. And I was told, well, that's sad, but you have a game on Saturday. And, I was told to suck it up, buttercup, so to speak.
Right.
And held that in for a long time and suddenly started crying and not wanting to play football for when I turned 14 and 15. And I didn't understand what was going on. And so by the time I turned 16, I read a great book called Feeling Good, the New Mood Therapy by David Burns, which really inspired me to never let someone be in that situation ever again. It's not something I think I can do solely on my own, obviously, but I'll do my best to help out other people. So that's what really drew me to mental health counseling, which brought me to an inability to find a job in Montreal for XYZ reasons in mental health after my degree in McGill in 1999. So I found this ad that looks like I was going to work on a boat as a mental health counselor in the Montreal Gazette. And I didn't know what I was going into. And so I went to do an interview in Framingham, Massachusetts, and ended up working there. And I started working on a crisis team there. When you work with a crisis team for mental health, you work with a lot of police. You work with a lot of ambulance and fire, just because there's a lot of crisis. That's what people call you for. I've jokingly said, not to disrespect any first responders, I called our team the first responders and a half. We're not quite the first responders, but we're kind of in the front line with them. And because of that, so I had a colleague, Sarah Abbott Carr at the time, Sarah Abbott, who created a program called Jail Diversion Program. And I was involved with that. She kept me in the loop. I went on calls with police officers, and that really helped me understand a little more of where first responders came from. And that really was the start of my community justice programs that I worked with. After doing that, I did that for a long time. I did it on and off for 15 years, really. But I also worked at a parole office where I started in Massachusetts, and where we started the reentry program. I was the one who devised the evaluation and how to get the right resources to people. So that was something that I really enjoyed doing. And I worked in a jail, and I worked with probation, and I worked with courts, what we call now recovery courts or drug courts at the time. And I helped put in place 2 drug courts across the state of Massachusetts, in addition to consulting with several others. So I got a lot of experience talking to a lot of people who are first responders and in that setting. And I really realize all the unique challenges that they have, because it is not the same as the general population. It's almost like you're going into a completely different civilization, because they have their own quirks. They have their own things that they work on. And it's not exactly something that's great dinner table kind of conversation for them. And because a lot of first responders are military, not all of them, of course, but many, I ended up working with a lot of military personnel. And I also worked with a nonprofit called Rifle to Rods here in Ashland, Massachusetts, and just trying to help people who go through these unique challenges. And I started getting referrals because of that in my private practice. Oh, Steve knows. And one thing I learned is first responders definitely want people who been there, because they really have unique challenges. And they're not, there is some chronic uniqueness that comes from that sometimes. But ultimately, like when people walk in, like, oh, you've been there, you understand. And that brings me a lot of credibility. And I also want to shout out my good friend who was in the military, Jay, and who ended up being a police officer, which also helped my experience.
That's great. Yeah, I love the way you say you never do this by yourself. Right, you've got to bring in good people around you, and someone that's got credibility in your space, that can really understand those quirks. This trauma that first responders go through at a higher level than anybody, right? I mean, they're called to a traumatic experience. So we hear a lot about trauma today. You might expect a trauma in a person who's gone through something terrible, like you went through with your friend as a childhood and first responders, but trauma is more prevalent than people think, just in everyday life as well, over and above first responders. Can you help us understand trauma and how that has long-term effects on us and short-term and even with regular people, right?
Right. And I think that what the first misunderstanding that occurs is people think trauma is PTSD, and trauma and PTSD are very different.
Okay.
So the first thing I would say is that trauma is kind of like, because French is my first language, I like to use very easy language. And my easy language to say is overwhelming experience. Trauma is an overwhelming experience. Pandemic, anyone? And, what I tell people is that we all been through different levels of trauma. And there's a lot of different ways to look at it. We obviously talk heavily about childhood trauma and what happened with that. We talk about sexual trauma a lot, but the traumas that we don't really talk about, there's a lot of workplace trauma that occurs if you had an overwhelming boss or a colleague, which causes trauma. And then a lot of what, the social media and the stuff that has been going on in the last 20 or 25 years with the computers is cyber trauma, and how that affects a whole lot of people, because people get so upset in regards to people's views on the internet, and they get really agitated, which is the overwhelming experience, which is trauma. So I always like to talk about trauma as something that we all went through, and it's something that it is difficult. Where it differs from PTSD, and I find myself very clinical suddenly, is PTSD is also time-based. So if something is traumatizing for over 6 months, typically it will become PTSD, but you have to have a certain set criteria. Recurring memories that are intrusive, nightmares, flashbacks, and avoiding these situations, mood issues that are not going away after the traumatic event. So that's more of a PTSD. And what I tell people is that there is a difference, and you really need to look at that. We throw PTSD around like it's, M&Ms or Smarties for us Canadians. And I think that from my perspective, it's always very important to tell the difference between the two, because we can all have trauma, but that doesn't mean we all have PTSD.
Right. And by the way, Adrian, before you get going, I just want to say, Smarties are way better than M&Ms.
Well, and for folks listening in America, Smarties are not they're chocolate. They're not the little, pasty, cookie,
Well,
things. They're the real. They're the real deal.
Well,
They're the candy things. They're really good. Yeah,
They
they're really good.
are good.
Yeah.
I'll
And a reason to open the border, to get Smarties. Yeah.
I'll sacrifice one of my links if you want to put a Smarties link there.
You got it.
And this is so important what you're talking about, Steve, about trauma, because as you went through when you were younger, we still, unfortunately, a lot of us are still in the rub some dirt on it mentality. We certainly grew up in that age where you never talked about mental health. There'd be some sort of stigma. So let's get into your podcast is about therapy. Let's start talking about, how in the world do we even just get started in finding a therapist and beginning this process?
Well, I know the biggest challenge right now in America and Canada is we don't have enough therapists, which is the biggest problem right now. So let's start off with saying that. But more importantly, I think that it's finding the right therapist. Because, one of the misconceptions that I kind of, we talked a little bit about it with the first responders. They want people who can relate. I like to think about, you had a guest not too long ago that talked about teens talking to teens about stuff, which I thought was a great idea. And AA or any type of anonymous program where, someone who has an addiction talks to someone with an addiction. And I think that having someone who can relate is so important. So how do we find a therapist is not just he does CBT, DBT, EMDR, or any of those acronyms that really make me sick, frankly. It's about really just getting the best therapy. I've done this on my podcast. The best therapy is none of those. The best therapy is therapeutic alliance, if you can relate to your therapist. So one of the things that happens a lot is that people are looking for typical, I heard that what I need is EMDR. I was told I needed EMDR, and I went to a therapist, and she was brilliant, and we never did EMDR, and I worked through my trauma. And that doesn't mean that the technique is what's important. It's really trusting the other person, and that's the best thing I can say that I have with my clients. Being able to look at it as a therapist, one of the things that is also important is to know what you're coming in with. And what I mean by that is this. If you have someone who's like, I want to work on blank, then your job as a therapist and a client is to work on blank. Because it's not just a therapist to sit there and go, I can mind read you. I mean, I'm not Kylo Ren from Star Wars. I can't just put my hand up and go, I know what you're feeling. I think it's important to come in with also wanting to work. And sometimes it's because someone has credibility because it's a referral from someone you know. Sometimes it's like, this guy's worked in first responders like I have, and that brings me credibility. Sometimes it's a gender. Sometimes it's not having a gender and working through some of those issues from transgender but really finding a therapist that you can relate to is going to be key to very good therapy. And I always remind my clients in the first few sessions, it's like, let's do 2 or 3 sessions and let's revisit. And like, what do you mean? Well, maybe I'm not your cup of tea.
Right.
I'm pretty direct. The name of the business is Straight to the Point Therapy, and it's really what I do. But I think at the same time, I'm not everyone's cup of tea, and I never pretend I am. Right. And I think that looking at your therapist, if a therapist says, no, you got to stick here, you got to do this, here's the 14 techniques I use, that's probably not for me personally. It could be for someone else. And I'm not saying that that's bad, but really looking at your therapeutic alliance and how it really makes you feel. It's not about, I have clients who have significant trauma that has gone on for like decades without treating it.
Right.
My job is not to go, hey, how are you? Let's talk about your childhood trauma. That's not my job. My job is like, what's going on, and build sometimes I have 40-year-old clients who have had trauma since age 5. Wow. Me jumping into trauma is not a great idea for me. Building their skills, building their abilities, feeling self-sufficient, self-reliant, and then feeling that they can handle it, then we can go there. But I think it's also important to do all those things. Sorry.
Yeah, Steve, it's really interesting. You touched on a lot of really great points there. And we want to get into addiction, and how we can support friends, particularly through the pandemic. Addiction went way up, self-medication, prescription drugs, and so on. Before you jump into that, I want you to spend a little bit of time. How do you get people over the shame and trauma of asking for a therapist? That's part of it too. There's still a big stigma, right? Hey, if you've got a therapist. Now, I live just outside New York, and if you don't have a therapist, you're the odd one out, right? It's a different culture. And yet there's still, particularly in business, when you say, you would never say to your boss, by the way, I got to leave early. I've got a therapy session. They go, oh, about what? Childhood sexual trauma. I mean, you'd never, you know what I mean? So how do you get people to couch it in a way that not only they're comfortable with it, their company is comfortable with it, and you don't have that shame and trauma of, I've got to go to therapy?
Well, the first thing I always talk about for those who have, and obviously I work with first responders, and sometimes they can be resistant. And
Right.
what I
They're
talk
tough
about,
guys, right? They're tough guys.
and tough women.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a tough guy world, but to be a woman in that environment, while things have significantly improved, and I'm not saying they haven't, it's even harder to be a woman in that environment. And I think that these are tough women, and they've learned how to repress really freaking well.
Huh. I can
And
only imagine. Yeah.
and I think that what you need to do, for me, like when you think about getting someone into therapy around that, first of all, it's very easy for me. I said, if you go for your broken leg at the doctor, are you going to be ashamed to have a broken leg?
Right.
Well, mental health, it's health. You go for physical health with no problem. Mental health is the same thing. And I don't know if it's going to happen in my lifetime, but I hope it does. One of my missions is to get people to do one mental health check-in a year, even if they're doing well, just to check in. I think that we need to start looking at it as a health issue, just like a broken leg, asthma, COVID, whatever the case may be. I'm not trying to pick on any particular thing. So the first thing you got to do is kind of like remind them that mental health is a health issue. And I think that lifts a lot of the stigma from people. And they look at it and like, oh, I'm like, yeah. So if you're good up to, as my friend Jay says, he's like, if it's from here, like you can't see me, from my neck down, oh, that's cool. You can talk about it. If it's up here, oh, let's not talk about that. That's horrible. Even if someone has even a physical mark, it's always hard to go, what's that on your face? So it's really not only like, it's really up to the head. And I think that what I tell people is that if this is handling your body, what, 80-90% of the time, because it's like, that's where it's coming from, why aren't we looking at that first? So to lift the stigma of mental health is to make them understand that your brain is as important as your arm, as your leg, as your any part of your physical body. So I think that that's how you lift a big part of the stigma. And a lot of police officers that I've worked with, a lot of firefighters and military, they can't kind of respond to that because, oh yeah, that makes sense. So I think that that's how I would introduce the first thing, is to also, and if you have a friend or a family member that's having trouble with some of the mental health issues, my biggest pet peeve in the world is someone who tells, hey, how are you? Good. How are you? Good. And if you live in New York, that's happening. The Northeast, we're like a tough bunch.
Right.
Right. But I tell people, like, if you ever ask me how I'm doing, you're going to get an answer, whether you like it or not. And I don't know if that's the Quebecer in me, and I don't know if it's just me, but when people, and I have had a boss one day who pulled me aside. He says, when I come in and I ask you how you're doing, I really don't want to know.
I don't want chapter and verse. Yeah. I'll never forget. I moved to New York. I grew up in Vancouver, spent some time in Chicago, just briefly for training. I come to New York and said, hey, how's it going? The guy says, what's it to you? I was really just saying hi.
What do you want to know?
Yeah.
So get into addiction, Steve. Tell us a little bit about, unfortunately, everybody knows somebody, especially after the pandemic, somebody who's maybe struggling with addiction. Walk us through some things we should be looking for and maybe ways to help.
Well, the first thing is addiction is something that we all have. And my theory is that we all have some sort of addiction. Some of us, it's our phone. Some of us, it's TV shows. Name it, we have some sort of addiction. And some of them are healthy and some of them are not so healthy. So let's start with that. So that lifts a little bit of the stigma of addiction sometimes. If I tell people like, oh, someone who has a drug problem, they judge them. I say, okay, give me your phone and we'll keep it from you for a year. What? No. I'm like, oh, so suddenly addiction makes sense to you. So that's how I confront addiction. Because I think that what we need to understand is that addiction is something we've all struggled with at some point in time. Some of them causes physical symptoms, such as opioids, opiates, meth and stuff like that. And then some of them call a psychological response. And we talk about behavioral ones like phones, sex, gambling. And some of them are psychological, as in marijuana and stuff like that, which doesn't have a physiological response, but you have a very large psychological addiction to it. So addiction is something that we need to, again, work on the stigma, just kill the stigma right away. and have a longer conversation about it. And what I've kind of explained to people, I've had this recently with someone who talked about addiction, and actually happened yesterday. They were telling me about how they don't understand addiction. And I did the phone thing, and I said, and the reality is we all say the same thing. You should just stop. Oh, geez, I didn't think of that. That's a great idea.
Why didn't you tell me that 2 weeks ago? Yeah,
I just paid a shrink for a year for this. And at the end of the day, it's kind of like realizing that the easy answer is not easy, because
Right.
they would have already done it.
Yeah.
And the shame that comes with addiction is that if someone has an addiction issue, the first thing you got to do is thank them. And what I've said to many folks is, thank you for sharing that with me, even in therapy, and I'm the professional.
Yeah.
And people are very, very touched by that. I'm like, oh, I didn't. And I said, yeah, because that's hard. Even in treatment, sometimes people relapse. And if they relapse, I'm kind of weird. I go, all right, you relapse. All right, let's go. Let's do some work. And they're like, really? I'm like, what, you want me to shame you? Because everyone does that and doesn't work.
Right.
Nothing I can say to shame you, you haven't said in your head at least 10 times.
Hey, Steve, how do people learn more about your important work? Where would you send them?
Well, I do have an Instagram account under Real Steve Bisson. And I also have a website, Bisson LMHC. And obviously my podcast, Finding Your Way Through Therapy, is available on all great platforms across the internet. And I also have a Facebook account, Steve Bisson LMHC, which is similar to my Instagram account. So those are ways to reach me.
So you sound like you're kind of hard to find.
You're kind of like everywhere, Steve.
I live under a rock in Massachusetts. That's what I do.
Yeah. We've talked a lot about first responders and so on, but you've thrown around a lot of acronyms, and one of them was CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. And you say it's really an effective treatment for anxiety and depression. Can you just give us a walk through a little bit of CBT and why it's kind of a preferred method over others for anxiety and depression?
Absolutely. So CBT is a great treatment for anxiety and depression because it really works on the definition of cognitive behavioral therapy. How I explain it to people is it's to work on your faulty thought process. Again, being a Quebecer, first language being French, I like to use very simple language, and that really helps me understand stuff, frankly, but it also helps people I work with to understand that it's not like if you say, I'm going to do cognitive behavioral therapy. I've had someone said, is it like, a lobotomy? Are you going to open my brain? So you got to, first of all, make it simple. And cognitive behavioral therapy is very effective with depression and anxiety because while it is not singularly that, because you might need medication and you might need other things, it's really a thought process issue. Depression is, the best way I've ever heard it described is depression is worry about the past and anxiety is worry about the future. And I always thought that was a great way to explain the difference between the two. And cognitive behavioral therapy is, Aaron T. Beck created that. The book David Burns that I talked about earlier is what introduced me to the cognitive distortions and how to attack automatic negative thoughts and stuff like that. So basically cognitive distortion are things we all do, all or nothing thinking, overgeneralization, emotional reasoning, jumping to conclusion, mental filters, personalizing. There's a lot more, but those are the ones I remember off the top of my head here. And I think that what you have to do sometimes is to look at it as a thought process issue and learn how to challenge it. And that's what depression needs. That's what anxiety needs. Sometimes you'll need medication in order to be better at challenging it, and that's okay. But I think it works a lot of what I call conditionals. There's a sign in my office that talks about the 7 dirty words in my office, just like a George Carlin thing. But the 7 dirty words are if, but, try, could, should, would, probably. And the reason why those are swears is because they're all conditionals. You're all conditioning the changes in your life. And I tell people, don't condition yourself. When you have depression and anxiety, you can't condition yourself. It's a hard thing to change. So cognitive behavioral therapy really works on your thought process and changes how your neurons actually connect in your brain. I don't want to go into neurology here, but that's really how I explain it. And if someone's making an overgeneralization, be ready to challenge it. I do them every day. There's the overgeneralization right there. But I also learned how to challenge him when I say him. And it's not like, oh my God, I did that. That's horrible. No, I did that. How do I challenge it? And it's also, again, I come back to a lot of mental health, and you talked about it earlier. Let's lift the shame.
Right.
And if you lift the shame of depression, anxiety, and the thought process, people are more willing to do it than like, oh, you still think like that? That's a challenge that is not healthy for any human being. So really learning how to look at the thought process and challenging it is important.
Yeah, and I love the idea of forgiving ourselves, being more accepting of who we are, that it's not a perfect straight line up in this world. Yeah. So tell us a little bit about yourself. What do you do, Steve, what are your rituals of self-care? We're always interested in the people we talk with. What do they do to maintain their mental health?
Well, one of the things that I encourage everyone, and I certainly do, and I don't do these every day, but I'll do yoga. I'll do a walk, I'll do a run, I'll go lift weights, or I'll do some sort of physical activity. Because if you don't, you need to think about, I think about my clients as a triad of, I call it physical, mental, and spiritual health, mind, body, spirit. And learning how to do something physical is important. So to tell you that I do all three of those every single day, no, I do probably one of those every day. I took a walk right before our interview here, just to clear my head, be ready for this interview, and helps really a lot. After I'm done with the interview here, I'm going to have downtime for about an hour. Maybe I'll eat. Maybe I'll watch some TV show that makes no sense, or watch a rerun that I've seen 100 times. But scheduling downtime, and it doesn't have to be downtime for 7 hours. It could be 30 minutes. I do an hour. But always scheduling some downtime is a good way for me, that really helps. My bedtime ritual is probably what I would say is what changed my life. About a couple of years ago, I learned about bedtime routines and how important they are. So I shut the TV, shut my medias of whatever phone or whatever I'm working at. And then I usually, and yes, I'm very masculine, take a bath. Uh, and I don't have a problem with that because it helps me relax. Sometimes I'll read, sometimes I won't. But after I'm done with that, I go meditate. Is it 5 minutes? Is it 10 minutes? Depends on the day. And, meditation is not something that people talk about. Like, they make it too hard sometimes. Sometimes it's like 5 minutes. It's okay. You do a half hour. I love it. But I go back to the Buddha saying one day, and I always like this statement: you should meditate every day, but if you have no time, you should meditate for an hour.
So in other words, meditate. Yeah.
Right. And, the meditation leads to journaling. I journal in my journal for, so sometimes it's 5 lines, sometimes it's a little more, sometimes it's less, whatever it is. And then I read, because for me, reading really gets my mindset into sleep. Try to get the same times to bed every day. But this is my self-care routine. Not always perfect, obviously. As you said earlier, I thought it was a great point. We're human. We're not going to be perfect. And I have 2 young daughters who keep me busy. So sometimes that can get in the way of that self-care stuff.
Yeah, it's really interesting that you really focused on that sleep routine. So funny, my wife and I were just talking about it last night. I said, we've got to get a better routine. We're going to bed too late. We're not getting enough sleep. And how often, Adrian, have we heard that people, when they don't get their sleep, that's when stuff starts to unravel. And we make bad decisions. We get more emotional. We lose our temper and so on. Well, Steve, great fun. I love the way you have a humorous way of in talking about difficult subjects. It's always good to laugh. But if you wanted people to take away 1 or 2 things from our conversation today, what would be those 1 or 2 things you'd want them to remember?
I think the first thing that I really want to get is that mental health is as important as your physical health.
Okay.
I will continue to, until the day I'm probably not here anymore, mental health should be something you do at least once a year. And I know some doctor appointments, they kind of do that sheet with 10 questions to see if you're doing, go sit with a therapist, see how you're doing. You don't need it for a year. That's awesome. I have clients who come in every 3 to 4 months. Why? They're like, you're kind of like my oil change, but making mental health part of your routine, just like physical health is. And I think that's the first thing I would say. Number 2, working with a lot of first responders, remembering that they're humans. I think that what happens is that first responders are under significant scrutiny across the board, and learning to be like, they're humans. They're not perfect. They can't explain what the cop did in Phoenix or Vancouver. They don't know them. They're not all the same. And learning to just humanize that behavior. And my work with the first responders is so important to me. And that humanizing is really part of it.
That's so great. Hey, listen, it's been a delight to have you on the podcast, Steve. Such great insights, particularly with first responders, the people that are under so much pressure every time there's a call for help. And as a fellow Canadian, I really appreciate your take. And you did say XYZ. I was a little disappointed. I thought for sure you'd say XYZ. But other than that, I think you passed the test. So as we leave you, I'll leave you. I know you know this saying from the indomitable Red Green: keep your head up and your stick on the ice. Thanks for being on the show, Steve.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you.
Well, Chess, another really fascinating session here, this time with Steve Bisson, trauma therapist and from upstate, actually the New England area, formerly of Canada. So interesting there. But loved what he started talking about here with trauma, that, look, we've all been through trauma. It could be a bad boss. It could be something that's happened online. That we have to understand this is something that we've all been through at different levels, and we've got to process.
Yeah, and I love the way he didn't just say first responders, that you can have trauma in the workplace. You've got an overbearing boss, and that it was different than PTSD. That trauma is short term. The PTSD is got a longer timeline, nightmares, flashbacks, and so on. I love that he made that distinction, because so often we do make them interchangeable. I'll tell you one of my big takeaways, and I'm going to commit on the podcast to do this, is the yearly mental health check-in.
Yeah.
It's like, he says, I got guys that come in every 3-4 months. It's like changing the oil. It's a mental checkup. And I thought that is such a healthy way to look at it. We go for a physical checkup every year. We would never miss, right?
I had a university professor we were chatting with, and we said, what would you tell, parents, before they send their kids off to college? And he says, what I would do? He says, I would have them go to one therapy session, no matter if you think they're the healthiest kid in the world. They're going to come here, they're going to leave home, and they're going to struggle. And if they don't have the tools to deal with it, that's going to be a problem.
Yeah.
Send them to at least one session. They'll learn techniques of when I get lonely, when I get miserable, when I get stressed and anxious, and they will.
Well, and the idea that takes away the shame, right? It's a checkup. And we've heard this before. If you had a broken leg, you'd take care of it. Well, I did love the way he said, from the neck down, you can talk about anything. The neck up, he says, even if it's a physical thing, hey, what's that on your face? I thought it was just like, you never think, what's that on your face? It's just my nose. It's just my nose. That when we talk about our heads, it's a different game, and it shouldn't be. The other thing that I thought was just so brilliant was when he talked about addiction. He says, by the way, we all have addictions. Oh, I don't have any addictions. Great. Just give me your phone.
Yeah. Well, what? I mean, don't we get panicked? I mean, if my phone, where's my phone?
Even him saying that made me anxious, and he's not even in the room with me. So this idea that, look, make it very relatable. We've all been through trauma. We've all got some kind of addiction, normalizing the conversation, and then finding a therapist. I think he called it a therapeutic alliance. Find somebody that fits. They throw in all these acronyms. Well, yeah, maybe or maybe not. Is it somebody you can relate to? Is it somebody that you can trust? Is really the most important part in picking.
And and I love this point. Not just somebody who says, you should stop. That's I'd never thought of that. And people do that all the time. You should just put a smile on that face. Really, because I'd never thought about that. I'd never really thought I should just look on the bright side.
Yeah. And what was the other thing he talked about when people come and ask for help, you say thank you. Yeah, I thought that was so great. Thank you. Well, what do you mean thank you? Well, what do you want me to do? Shame you? You've already shamed yourself enough. You don't need me to pile on. So thank you for coming in and sharing that with me. Let's work on the help side. He talks about his therapy being straight to the point, and he is straight. And isn't it refreshing? It's just unvarnished. Yeah. He's definitely our kind of hockey player.
Yeah. And, the idea here is this is the 1% solution. You're trying to get better each day, but you're not going to make wholesale changes. You're going to slowly get better, and you're going to have fallbacks, and that's human. We're all human. And so be gentle and kind to ourselves. So again, great session with Steve Bisson. Special thanks to Steve being on, to our producer, Brent Klein. to Christy Lawrence, who helps us find amazing guests, and to all of you who listened in today.
And to our great sponsor, Life Guides. You know, this community of certified guides that walk you through all the things that you're dealing with in life. You know, they deal with so many different life challenges, whether it be economic or emotional or physical and so on. And the Life Guides mission is to grow a community for sharing this life experience with wisdom and empathy, with the goal of positively impacting 1 billion people within the next 15 years. They're modernizing human support and human connection, which is foundational to well-being. What I really like about Life Guides as well is they say, look, it's not just a better work life, it's just a better life. So for listening to our podcast, you get 2 months free access for your team. All you got to do on checkout is put in 2422 for 2 months free access. Well, Adrian, we really have been getting some just wonderful guests. I love Steve Bisson. I love his direct approach. And again, thank you to all of you that have tuned in. Download the podcast and please share it with friends. You know, our goal is that we can make a difference with this podcast and normalize the conversation around anxiety and mental health. Adrian, what else would you add?
Well, thanks everybody for joining us today, and we wish you nothing but the best of mental health.